Today, we're talking about an important watch from Seiko's history. It's a watch that brings together all kinds of weird details, and they work together way better than they should. It's a watch that you couldn't even get in the US when it came out. It was a forum darling for a generation, and it still kind of is today. It likely had a big influence on your collecting, certainly your views on Seiko. I know it sure did mine. My name is Blake Bettner, this is Worn and Wound, and today we are looking at the Seiko Alpinist SARB017. Let's get into it. This is a watch that was released in 2006. However, the Alpinist name nomenclature goes back much further than that in Seiko's history, starting in the late 50s with the Alpinist Laurel. These are all kind of traditional mountaineering tool field watches. The name was resurrected in a different way in 1995, however, with the so-called Red Alpinist. It brought an entirely new design to the mix, set of cathedral hands, a rotating compass bezel, a few odd details that really set it apart from prior field watches from Seiko. Kind of a cult favorite back then, but what really set this thing off was a re-release of that design in 2006 with the SARB collection of watches that included this very watch, the SARB017, with an almond green dial, gold accents, retaining that internal compass bezel, as well as the cathedral hands. There's a lot of odd details about this watch, and while it may no longer be to a modern taste in some ways, this watch is a perfect example of being more than the sum of its parts. This is a watch that still holds up really well today, and it probably had some kind of influence on your early collecting if you've been in the game for a long time, or even if you're new to this space. This is a watch that has a lot of lore to it, and it's something that you've likely come across on forums or on Instagram in some way, shape, or form. I still see these enter the market every now and then these days. Okay, so what is the Alpinist SARB017? This is a steel watch that measures 39 millimeters in diameter, a little over 12 millimeters in thickness, and a little over 46 millimeters from lug to lug. It wears beautifully, kind of disappears on the wrist. I generally wear mine on a different strap. I've always found this brown leather alligator strap to be a little stiff for me. But on the right strap, this is still a watch that works really well today and quite legible as well. Inside, Seiko is using the 6R15 automatic movement. It has 50 hours of reserve, and in my experience has been reasonably accurate as well. This is a watch that still exists in some form today within the Seiko Prospects collection. They have gotten away from the Alpinist naming, and it represents an important part of Seiko's heritage outside of the kind of dive watch area that we're used to following them for. All right, so this is the Seiko SARB017. It came out in 2006. It was also offered in a beige colorway and a black colorway, but this green colorway is the one that really kind of stands out to me. It's just kind of unusual. It's a very warm green, and when paired with the gold, it's not a colorway that you're used to seeing on kind of straightforward field watches or tool watches. And that's not the only thing about this watch. It's kind of unusual for the genre. This color scheme was originally selected in the 90s to pair with this brown leather alligator textured strap. It all works together, and again, if you pick apart any of these elements, it might be slightly objectionable or not quite to your taste, but put them all together in this watch, and it kind of works better than it has any business doing. And that might be the nostalgia talking. In fact, it probably is. But there's a lot of other lore built into this watch that has kind of deepened its appeal. It certainly did back then, and it still does now. So one of the other details that is also unique to this watch is the cathedral hands. Kind of an ornate set of hands, especially in the context of a field watch, a watch that's called the Alpinist, of course. They read time against applied hour markers, with every even hour represented in sans serif Arabic numerals. All of those markers are plated in gold. They pop off of this green dial really well, and that green dial has kind of a warmth to it that perfectly matches the gold tones of those hour markers. But again, kind of an unusual sight on something that we generally think of as like a very straightforward, legible, simple genre of watches here. This kind of does away with all that, but again, it's very legible and usable, and it kind of quickly sets it apart from everything else in this genre of watches. The other thing that sets this watch apart is the internal rotating bezel that has compass markings on them. This is controlled through the crown at 4 o'clock, and to use it, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you set the watch head parallel to the ground like this and orient it such that the hour hand is pointing towards the sun, and then you would put the south marker between that hour hand and the 12 o'clock hour marker. And if you've done it right, you should have your bearings there in terms of what's north, south, east, west. If you're in the southern hemisphere, I believe you'd put the north marker between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock marker there. Just how practical this is in real world use, I'm not quite sure. I've never had to use it in the context of being out hiking or lost, thankfully, but a more handy outdoorsy person, I'm sure, could make use of this thing just fine if you found yourself without an actual compass. But aside from that, I think it's a pretty interesting kind of visual detail here. It's just not something that you're used to seeing, especially on like an internal bezel like this. And that second crown at 4 o'clock, I think, offers a lot of unique kind of visual charm to this watch overall. And again, it's kind of an unexpected pairing with things like Cathedral Hands and gold-plated markers and deep green dial. This whole thing kind of feels like it shouldn't work. But again, you put all these things together and somehow it rises above all that and just becomes something else entirely. Now, I mentioned that this watch has a lot of lore built around it, and that's because when it was released in 2006, it was only available in the Japanese domestic market. I remember coming across this watch maybe around 2010, 2009 on the forums, probably in the same way that a lot of you did. This was kind of the most recommended watch that I remember seeing, and finding a way to get one was part of the adventure of this watch, and it was a big part of the appeal of this watch. It led me, and likely many of you, to discovering a site called Saya Japan, where you could get watches that were made for the Japanese domestic market. That's how I landed one back in 2010 or so, and I remember feeling like having one of these watches was kind of a sign that you were a part of the in crowd in the hobby in those early days. So I think that part of its history kind of lends a lot to the appeal that it has to this day. If you went through a similar experience, I know that kind of adds a lot of the appeal to me personally. That said, there's a lot of things here that aren't exactly to my taste these days. And I've got no problem saying that. The Cathedral Hands, the green and the gold, these aren't things that I would gravitate towards now. But again, it's kind of a theme of this watch. It kind of brings these things together in a careful and dignified way that elevates them beyond its individual components. So that's what's made the Seiko SARB017 such a long-lasting watch for me, and has probably passed in and out of your collection over the years as well. We'd love to know what you think about this watch. Did you have one? How did you get one? Would you like to see Seiko bring back the Alpinist name? And if so, how would you like to see them do it? And that is the Seiko Alpinist SARB017. We've got much more of my thoughts now live on morningwound.com, so don't forget to head over there for a much more in-depth take on this watch. Jump into the comments either there or here with your thoughts on this watch. Let us know your history with it. We'd love to hear it. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. If you enjoyed this content, please be sure to leave a like and share. We appreciate it a lot. And until next time, take care.